Welcome back to Witness. Fortunately, until now, there's been little call for Australians to have expertise in the workings of the mass murderer's mind. But in the US, a regular parade of violence has created a need for specialists to provide answers. Joining us from Washington, D.C. tonight is Clint Van Zandt, a former member of the FBI's elite behavioral science unit. He was the FBI's chief hostage negotiator and has worked recently on both the Waco and Unabomber cases. Mr. Van Zandt, is it possible, from where you sit, to make sense of what we here in Australia see as a senseless killing?
What happens so many times is that you'll find an individual who has a fantasy. That fantasy may be, it may have some type of connotation as far as who he'd like to date, some sexual connotation, or it can have a violence connotation attached to it. Well, we have fantasy here and we have reality here. What happens many times is there needs to be a bridge between the two, and a lot of times that bridge is other negative acts that he may read about. I would suggest a situation that took place in Scotland a few weeks ago where the children were slain in the school, and the number of incidents that have happened in the United States, the sarin gas attack in Japan. Any of these can form that emotional or psychological bridge that allows an individual like this to move from fantasy to reality.
So you are saying that events like those in Dunblane and like those in Japan would actually have perversely inspired him to act the way that he did act?
Something like this can provide the catalyst to allow him to move forward. Now, I would also suggest that many times it's violent movies, other things such as this where you see an individual act out negatively. I can recall a situation in the United States in Stockton, California, where a individual who had failed out of high school a year or two later stayed up at night, watched two very violent movies over and over again. The next day went to his former high school, shotgunned his former teacher to death, shot and killed 2 or 3 other students, and took 100 students hostage, and it took us all day and into the night to negotiate with him before we could get him out.
Now, you say that this is something that the killer would have planned. To what extent? To the extent of choosing a location, choosing people that might be the subject of his attacks?
Well, again, he's the only one that can tell us accurately what he did and why he did it. But if you look at the location that he chose, the remoteness of it, the distance that your forces would have to travel to deal with a situation like that. And what I find also is that not only did he, of course, come prepared with his weapons in a bag, but he chose an environment where people were happy. He chose an environment where there were couples, there were families, there were children, many things that perhaps were negative to him because he had never been able to achieve those type of relationships, or perhaps felt he never would be able to achieve that type of relationship.
Is it possible to look at all into the kind of family background, the kind of history that a person like this may have had?
Well, I think it really has to be done. I think you have to look back. He only completed the 10th grade and dropped out of school for that at that point. You know, why did he do that, and were his parents in a place to encourage him to go forward or not? You know, you always look at an individual, and we're always trying to decide, is it a matter of nature or nurture? In essence, was he born that someday he was going to be this, you know, perhaps the greatest mass murderer in this century? Or was it something, if he wasn't born, was it just a matter of the way he was nurtured as a child? There was something missing there. Again, you know, if we look in the United States right now, we're dealing with, of course, over the last 18 years, the Unabomber. And should the Unabomber prove to be the man the authorities have right now, which is, of course, Theodore Kaczynski, Mr. Kaczynski has suggested that his problems stem from his mother, and that his mother didn't take adequate care of him and didn't raise him the way he should have been raised. These are common defenses that come up, and you know, so many times we see an individual blaming his parents or society when the bottom line should be just look in the mirror, and that's who created the problems for yourself.
In this particular case, the killer was undiscriminating. His victims ranged from elderly people to very, very young children. Does that tell you anything?
Well, it says to me that he's crossed so many lines that you and I would draw in the sand. In essence, we may say, well, I could say something negative, or perhaps I can even be negative or violent against a certain class of people, but for him to violate all the constraints that we have as members of society, to wantonly kill children, and with the weapon that he had, one has to believe that you know, he had to aim and fire that weapon, and he did it very accurately, but he aimed at children where there's no way that he could hold a child accountable for anything that happened to him in life, which again to me suggests some type of psychotic break that he had with reality that would allow him to go to that extreme.
Is it possible to speculate on what precisely might be going through his mind as he's picking off one human target after another?
Well, hopefully he'll share that, you know, with you someday. We can speculate, and I would say speculation is that this is a very angry man, that he feels that all of his life people have let him down, be they teachers, be they parents, neighbors, girlfriends, and I think he's may well have said to himself, you're not going to get away with it anymore. And each person that he acted out with, and each person that he fired his weapon at, symbolized some wrong that society had done against him, and he just continued to act out against that. He's still responsible for what he did.
It sounds as though you believe that what this man did falls into a recognizable pattern, and yet he did choose to walk out of that burning building. Does that too fall into a pattern, or does it defy a pattern?
I think it somewhat defies a pattern. We see that level of violence, but so many times what we'll see a person do is come in, act out violently, act out negatively, kill, maim, but then turn the weapon on themselves and commit suicide, or do what we call victim precipitated homicide, or suicide by cop, where they commit a number of negative acts and then they force law enforcement to kill them, another form of suicide, except by the hand of the police officer. That's the response in this type of scenario you normally would have anticipated. What I would suggest here is that there was this small island of reason that he was standing on, surrounded by this vast sea of pathology, and that island, somewhat like some of the Branch Davidians who were with David Koresh at Waco a few years ago when that Holocaust started, and I was there at the time and watched it, that there were some Davidians who jumped from that building and ran, where the majority of the Davidians either shot themselves or stayed inside and let that building burn down around them. I would say that this individual had to make a decision at that last time, at that last second. Was he going to allow the building to burn down around him, or was he going to use it as some type of a diversion, again in his fantasy that he could create this diversion and then escape the authorities?
If there is, as you put it, a small island of sanity here, might there also be some remorse that this person is feeling today for what he has done?
There could be. I think that would be very positive if we saw that level of remorse. But every time he pulled the trigger of that weapon, he had a chance to undergo remorse and stop at that point. And up to and including the taking of hostages and the taking of their lives and then burning that building, each time he had a chance to deal with remorse and to deal with what he had done. And I would suggest that every time he chose to continue his actions. Now, today, next week, next month, will he come to a realization, I've done a terrible thing? I would hope that he does, just for his own sanity and for whatever concept he may have of a hereafter that he's going to have to deal with.
Mr. Van Zandt, I thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.